You were never supposed to hear this. Buried beneath the Appalachian fog in twisted branches of Blackwater creeks, there's a name they whispered when no outsiders were around. A people who weren't supposed to exist. A lineage the government tried to erase. The Melungeons, they were called half-breeds, anomalies, witches, even aliens. And every time history tried to label them, it missed the point completely. Because the truth of the Melungeons isn't just racial. It's existential. What if I told you their blood carried markers that didn't match any known group? That DNA tests, when honest, pointed to origins older than the colonies, older than the empires that ruled them, older than America itself? You've been taught history in straight lines: discovery, settlement, revolution, freedom. But the story of the Melungeons tears that timeline apart. Because if they are who some believe they are, everything you know about who came first, who ruled, and who belongs is a lie. They lived in hidden hollers and carved their homes into limestone cliffs long before settlers arrived. Not as slaves, not as natives, not as invaders, but as something else, something that doesn't fit into any textbook category. And so they were erased. Early census records were corrected. Land rights were revoked. Children were taken. Churches were burned. And still they survived, in silence, in secrecy, in shadows. For hundreds of years, they whispered there. Real names only at night. And now, their descendants are speaking again. Because DNA doesn't lie. And the results coming back from modern ancestry tests are sending genealogists into a panic. Clusters of unexpected markers. Traces of Portuguese, Turkish, North African, Jewish, even Middle Eastern bloodlines, all concentrated in small, isolated pockets of Appalachia. How could this be? Because the Melungeons carry a genetic ghost, a warning encoded in flesh. Proof of migrations we were never meant to remember. This isn't just about a people. It's about a buried timeline. One in which pre-Columbian transatlantic contact wasn't just possible, it happened. Again and again. But the conquerors who wrote the books made sure you never heard those stories. And what happens when a people exist outside empire, outside religion, outside the clean boxes of race and nation? They become dangerous. Not because they hold weapons, but because they hold memory. And memory is the one thing the system cannot afford you to keep. Because the moment you remember who you truly are, the entire machine begins to tremble. This is the descent into one of America's darkest genetic secrets. A truth buried in blood and bone, written in the dirt roads of Tennessee and Virginia, encoded in the stairs of families who never left. The hills, the Melungeons, are not a myth. They are a mirror, and once you look into it, you won't see America the same way ever again. The first time the government officially mentioned the Melungeons, they didn't name them, they classified them. In the 1800s, census takers in the Appalachian regions of Virginia, Tennessee, and Kentucky came across people who didn't fit into the categories of white, black, or Native American. Instead of asking questions, they wrote one word: mulatto. It was a legal trap. A single label that came with 1,000 invisible chains. Suddenly, land could be taken, voting rights revoked, marriages invalidated, children reclassified. And just like that, entire families vanished on paper. But paper isn't truth. It's control. And the first step in erasing a people is always bureaucratic. Before the torch, there's the file. Before the raid, the registry. The Melungeons were systemically misnamed, mislabeled, and misunderstood, not because the state didn't know who they were, but because it did. Behind closed doors, academic and government circles whispered about the anomalies. Portuguese sailors, Ottoman stragglers, lost Jews fleeing the Inquisition, or something even older, something Phoenician. Each theory more uncomfortable than the last. Why uncomfortable? Because it meant the story of America didn't begin with English pilgrims. It didn't begin with Jamestown. It didn't even begin with conquest. It began long before, with strangers who didn't look like the settlers, didn't pray like them, and didn't obey that, so they buried it. Anthropologists were told not to publish. DNA studies were delayed. And to this day, some Melungeon communities still report harassment when trying to access their family archives. Why? Because the truth that these people may be living evidence of pre-Columbian contact with the Old World threatens to shatter national myths that uphold ownership, identity, supremacy. See, it's not just about who was here first. It's about who has the right to claim the land, claim the power, claim the story. And the Melungeons? They were the crack in the narrative, the living contradiction. Which is why for decades, even saying the word Melungeon in public was enough to get you branded a conspiracy theorist. Or worse, an agitator. But they couldn't erase the blood. They couldn't scrub the jawlines, the olive skin, the dark eyes passed down through generations. They couldn't explain away the Turkish surnames in the hills of Tennessee. So they silenced instead. And the silence became a cloak, both protection and prison. For the Melungeons to survive, they had to become invisible. But now the silence is breaking, because the internet, for all its chaos, gave the descendants a voice. Stories once whispered over moonshine and firelight are now spreading across forums, ancestry threads, and encrypted files. And the deeper you dig, the darker it gets. Let's go back, not decades, not centuries, but millennia, before the first settler's boot touched Virginia soil, before Columbus made landfall, before the maps were redrawn by empires. There were roots, silent, sacred, and now erased, that crossed the Atlantic in both directions. The myth says otherwise, that no one came to America before 1492, that oceans were walls, not highways, that native peoples evolved in isolation, untouched by the Old World. But what if that was a lie? What if the ocean was never a barrier, but a bridge? The Phoenicians, master sailors, traders, mystics, were navigating the Mediterranean, and beyond as far back as 1200 BCE, their ships were built to endure the harshest waters. Their influence reached as far west as the Canary Islands. And some believe they pushed further, much further. Ancient maps found in Turkish and Egyptian archives show land masses identical to the Eastern American coast, drawn long before. Official discovery. Portuguese mariners whispered of black Irish and strange, dark-skinned people in the hills of Appalachia, long before transatlantic slave trade ever began. And then there's the story of Prince Madoc, a Welsh explorer, who, in 1170, allegedly sailed west and founded a colony in what is now Alabama. The natives there later spoke of pale strangers who lived among them, built stone walls, and vanished into the hills. Could these early visitors have mixed with local tribes, left their bloodlines embedded in the soil, created a hybrid identity that defied every category empire would one day demand? Because that's the Melungeon secret. They don't belong to any one origin. They are the crossroads. When researchers ran mitochondrial DNA tests on Melungeon remains in the late 20th century, the results stunned them. North African, Iberian, Anatolian, Jewish, and even Romani markers. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens when forgotten migrations meet suppressed memory. We've been taught that history moves one way, that civilization spreads outward from the so-called centers of progress. But in truth, knowledge, people, and blood move like tides. And some waves never made it into the textbooks. The Melungeons are proof of those tides. Evidence that the old world and the new world touched long before anyone was ready to admit it. And who decides what's real? Those who write the books. Those who fund the institutions. Those who burn the evidence. How we enter the vault, not of stone and iron, but of ink and silence. You see, when history is dangerous, they don't just deny it. They document it, then bury the documents. In 1923, A university researcher stumbled across a collection of colonial letters in a crumbling Virginia courthouse. In them, plantation owners wrote of dark settlers who traded salt, herbs, and steel with local tribes, long before British settlers arrived. The names, unfamiliar. The origins, labeled only as foreign. Those letters were sealed, misfiled, and for nearly a century, vanished from the academic record. They weren't alone. Military journals from early Spanish expeditions mention Casta, villages deep in the Smoky Mountains, communities of mixed peoples who spoke strange dialects, refused conversion, and had building styles unrecognizable to the empire. Missionaries reported stone temples, grave markers with Arabic script, and rituals that combined Mediterranean and native symbology. Each of those reports were redacted. All that remained were vague summaries, sanitized for public consumption. And then there are the maps. Private collections from France, Portugal, and the Ottoman Empire contain cartographic oddities, unnamed landmasses, strange coastlines, and annotations like Land of the Moors, scrawled across what is now the Carolinas. What if those weren't mistakes? What if they were warnings? Because the powers that ruled the old world understood one thing better than anyone: knowledge is power. And when that knowledge suggested a world outside their control, one filled with memory, identity, and bloodlines, they couldn't claim. They shut it down. Some say these documents were lost in wars. Some say fire. Some say incompetence. But too many went missing. Too many were rewritten. And the pattern is always the same. If it challenges the origin story, it disappears. That's not history. That's curation. So what does it mean when you find an old map in Istanbul showing Appalachian rivers before Columbus? Or when you read missionary journals that reference Melungeon surnames centuries before the term even existed? It means the erasure was deliberate. It means America's hidden people weren't just local mysteries. They were global anomalies. People who walked the fault lines between empires, whose very existence proved that history is not what we were taught, but what we were allowed to remember. And the Melungeons remembered. In song, in story, in scars. They say when a people are forbidden to write their history, they learn to sing it. In the deep hollows of Appalachia, by the flickering light of coal stoves and lanterns, the Melungeons passed down songs, not nursery rhymes, not patriotic hymns, but encrypted memories, lullabies soaked in grief, prayer, and blood. A child rocked to sleep might hear of black ships on silent waters, of stone circles glowing under moons no longer seen, of names that burned the tongue of outsiders. These weren't metaphors. They were codes. When empire burns your documents, bans your language, and steals your names, your last refuge is ritual. And that's where the Melungeons survived. In food prepared a certain way, in burial rites that echo Semitic customs, in dance patterns that resemble Berber tribes, in curses whispered in dialects no academic could fully trace. Anthropologists who dared to look closer, the few who weren't silenced, noticed something chilling: the oral patterns among Melungeon elders didn't match Anglo-Saxon or Cherokee rhythms. Instead, they mirrored those found in Sephardic Jewish exiles, in Romani clans, in Moorish fragments smuggled through Andalusia. These weren't Appalachian inventions. They were survival's fossils of identity, smuggled in the lungs of generations. And they all told the same story: we were here, long before you said we were allowed to be. One recorded chant, passed down by a matriarch known only as Granny Sal, described a God who lives in water and wind, a deity with no cross, no book, no church, a spiritual code that predated the missionaries. Her descendants recalled her tracing protective symbols in ash on their doors, patterns found not in Southern Christianity, but in North African mysticism. Ask yourself, how does that end up in Virginia? Simple. It never left, because this wasn't immigration. It was legacy. But the system doesn't just erase physical evidence. It attacks the intangible memory, pride, connection. That's why Melungeon families were taught not to speak of their ancestors. Why children were punished for asking why their grandmother had an Ottoman pendant, or why their uncle's funeral resembled a Sufi rite. The shame wasn't natural. It was engineered. And yet the lullaby survived. In minor keys that bent away from Western harmony. In lyrics filled with longing for islands across fire. In rhythms that made no sense until you heard them beside Tuareg desert drums. And now, as genetic results resurface and online forums cross-reference ancient tongues, the melodies make sense. They are not folklore. They are testimony. Voices from the edge of erasure, singing back into existence a people who were never supposed to survive, much less remember, but they did. And now you remember, too. In the old world, kings feared swords. But in the new world, they fear memory. Across Appalachia today, descendants of the Melungeons are waking up, not just through DNA results, but through something far more dangerous: ancestral ignition. The sudden, unexplainable knowing. A spiritual flash in the blood. A realization that what they were told to be ashamed of was actually their inheritance. For decades, being called a Melungeon was a slur. It meant you were other, tainted, not white enough, not black enough, not native enough. You were uncategorized, and that meant you were unprotected. But something has changed. Something ancient is rising in the bones of the forgotten. They are reclaiming the name. Melungeon groups are forming, not in anger, but in remembrance. Not as victims, but as guardians. Because when you carry a history too dangerous to be taught, it becomes sacred. Young men who once grew up hiding their ancestry are now tattooing their grandmother's surname into their skin. Women once mocked for their skin tone are now singing in ancient scales that mirror the Maghrib. The silence is cracking, not just online, but in real life. And that crack is terrifying the gatekeepers of history. You see, power doesn't just want to control you. It wants to name you, to define you within its frameworks. The Melungeons break that system. They aren't part of a neat ethnic narrative. They're not aligned with a state-sponsored identity. They are the wild variable, the proof that empires lie, and they are finding each other. Across Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, in the shadows of hills once soaked with erasure, the bloodlines are calling. Old photos once hidden in shoe boxes are now displayed with pride. Grandfathers who once denied their roots are now whispering the real stories on their deathbeds. This isn't nostalgia. This is resistance. Because what the system fears more than a weapon is a people who remember themselves. People who say, "We were never what you said we were, and we're not asking for permission to exist." That's where the rebellion starts. Not with war, not with fire, but with reclamation. A grandmother's recipe guarded like a spell. A funeral rite conducted in secret. A child's name spoken in a forbidden tongue. These are the battles of the blood. And in this section of the story, the war is not for land, it's not for politics. It's for truth, whispered, sung, carved into the walls of memory. And you're no longer a bystander. You've heard the songs, you've seen the maps, you know the codes. Now the question is, will you remember? In every ancient war, when the warriors died, the scribes followed. They didn't carry blades, they carried chisel and fire. And their task? To erase the names, erase the bloodlines, erase the symbols. But in the case of the Melungeons, something slipped through the cracks, scattered across Appalachian graveyards, often unmarked, half forgotten, shielded by thickets and fog. You'll find gravestones bearing strange carvings. Some look like stars, others like spirals. Crosses that don't quite match any Christian tradition. Moons placed beside triangles. Patterns that seem meaningless until you compare them to ancient Mediterranean funerary symbols. The resemblance is uncomfortable. One recurring image? A crescent cradling 7 dots, a mark found in Ottoman tombs, Moorish prayer stones, and even some pre-Islamic Berber altars. What's it doing on the grave of a Tennessee woman born in 1811? Another? Inverted triangles intersected with lines nearly identical to Phoenician death sigils. Scholars called it coincidence, but once is an accident, twice is pattern. And what we're seeing is a language not one of words, but of survivors. Melungeon cabins, those few still standing, often contain architecture that shouldn't be there. Lintels carved with patterns matching Hebrew mysticism. Hearth placements resembling Andalusian Islamic design. Foundations laid out not in squares, but octagons, echoing Eastern sacred geometry. And the most chilling discovery: a family Bible, found in a crumbling attic in Western Virginia. Its cover missing, pages mold-stained. But inside, marginalia written in what appeared to be Ladino, the nearly extinct language of Sephardic Jews exiled from Spain. This wasn't a Bible translation. It was a cipher, names, directions, codes, passed down not to preach, but to hide. Because when a people know they're being hunted, not for crime, not for conquest, but for identity, they adapt. They turn burial into encryption, architecture into code, rites into resistance. Every Melungeon symbol, every strange carving on wood or stone, is a message in a bottle thrown down the timeline, hoping that someone someday would know how to read it. And now that someone is you. This isn't just genealogy anymore. It's archaeology of the forbiddens, because for these people, memory was treason, and symbols were survival. Now ask yourself this: if Melungeon graveyards carry Ottoman and Phoenician glyphs, if their homes mirror Moorish temples, if their books speak in exiled tongues, then who were they really, and more importantly, who wanted them erased? You've seen the graves, you've heard the songs. Now it's time to meet the architects of silence. You may think the Melungeon mystery was simply overlooked, a historical footnote, ignored out of ignorance. But ignorance doesn't erase records. Ignorance doesn't mislabel census data. Ignorance doesn't order academic suppression. Control does. Let's start with the institutions. In the mid-20th century, when anthropology was becoming a science of power rather than truth, universities like the University of Virginia and institutions tied to the Smithsonian ran studies on Appalachian populations. But when anomalies showed up, genetic patterns that defied Eurocentric timelines, the reports were sealed, inconclusive, or mysteriously lost in transit. But where did they really go? Follow the funding. These studies weren't neutral. They were paid for by state agencies, often with quiet backing from foundations tied to defense contractors and eugenics programs. Yes, eugenics. In the 1930s and 40s, Virginia was at the heart of racial hygiene laws, forced sterilizations, racial reclassifications, erasure, not for progress, but for purity. The Melungeons were targeted. Why? Because they didn't fit the binary. Because their DNA exposed the lie of white supremacy. Because their very existence said, you didn't discover this land. You inherited it from those you tried to erase. In fact, one memo found decades later through FOIA requests revealed a chilling directive from a now-defunct federal program. Populations with ambiguous racial origin should be assigned consistent and administratively useful classification. Outliers are to be discouraged from genealogical publication. Translation? Bury them. Now you understand, this wasn't about science. It was about narrative management. Even in modern times, genealogical sites, the ones you might trust with your spit and your story, have quietly shifted. Melungeon linked markers into ambiguous categories like Southern European, broadly, Middle Eastern, or other. They don't want you connecting the dots. They want you confused. Rootless. Because a man without roots is easy to rule. And here's where it turns. Those same institutions now sell you heritage kits. They profit off the very history they once destroyed. They sell fragments of identity back to you at $99 per test. Identity they stole. But fragments won't save you. You need the whole pattern. And that's what they fear most. Because when you trace the Melungeon threads through graves, glyphs, DNA, ritual, and exile, you're not just learning history, you're reclaiming power. And power has a scent. It shakes the machine. It threatens the lie. So ask yourself, why would they spend millions erasing the people? Unless that people held something priceless, something dangerous. Memory is not just what we recall. It's how we store what the world tries to destroy. And the Melungeons? They didn't just survive through blood and song. They survived through something older and more powerful. Mnemonic architecture. See, in cultures with no written records, the body becomes the book. The home becomes the codex. Movement, repetition, placement, all encode meaning. And this is where the Melungeons left behind a trail that most historians overlooked. But it was never meant for historians. It was meant for those who remember. Anthropologists who studied Melungeon settlements in the 20th century were baffled. Homes built into hillsides with internal alignments that mimicked star patterns. Kitchen hearths not facing the sun, but due east toward ancient solstice lines. Cellars arranged in sacred geometry, not practical design. One cabin, abandoned. In Kentucky, had stones etched with double spirals at its foundation corners, an ancient Celtic and Berber symbol for duality and transition, not decoration. Not superstition. Instruction. Because when you live under surveillance, when your name, race, even existence is under erasure, you don't hide the truth in books. You embed it in space. Even the gardens mattered. Melungeon women were known to plant in triads, 3 types of herbs in triangle patterns, often mimicking Mediterranean healing rituals. Lavender, sage, rue, not for beauty, for preservation. Each plant, each placement, a line of a forgotten script. There are accounts from government inspectors in the 1930s, baffled by Melungeon families who refused to use English numerals. Instead, they marked time by lunar phases and planting cycles, an ancient agricultural rhythm used by Moorish farmers and Phoenician navigators. This wasn't folklore. It was method, a cognitive technology for surviving erasure. When you couldn't pass down books, you passed down ritualized architecture, embedded codes that taught identity through environment. And it wasn't just symbolic. Some Melungeon homes were mapped to resonate acoustically, echoes rebounding in calculated ways, allowing whispering from room to room, a form of silent communion. Others were built near underground springs, where water could carry vibration across stone. Not just homes, not just hideouts, transmission devices. Do you see what this means? They remembered what most forgot, that memory, identity, and environment are inseparable, that you can hide entire histories in the placement of a doorway, that your home can be a temple even if it looks like a shack. The institution saw only poverty. But what they missed was precision. And now, those structures are decaying, bulldozed, bought out, forgotten. Unless you remember, unless you understand that every Melungeon homestead was a map, not just to their past, but to yours, because you've inherited their exile. And now you must inherit their tools. Language is a weapon, and the most dangerous languages are the ones that aren't supposed to exist. The Melungeons spoke in ghost tongues, not English, not Cherokee, not French, something else. Something cobbled together from exile, migration, resistance. It wasn't just a dialect. It was a code. Early settlers called it gibberish, slurred mountain talk. But linguists who've traced field recordings and oral history interviews from the 1930s discovered the patterns weren't random at all. They found words with roots in Ladino, the language of Sephardic Jews exiled from Spain. They found phrases pulled from Berber dialects, twisted through Appalachian vowel shifts. Even fragments of Ottoman Turkish crept in, mutated by isolation and survival. Imagine a single sentence built like a labyrinth, each word pointing to a different continent, a different trauma, a different escape. This was not accidental. This was encrypted identity. Some Melungeon elders would whisper lullabies with phrases no one else understood. But when scholars translated them, they told stories of Andalusian nights, of ships sailing west to escape the burning cross, of blood oaths taken under moonlight, and of names that could not be spoken in daylight. Why hide language? Because language is the final claim. When the empire takes your land, your body, your rights, your last act of rebellion is to speak something it cannot translate, cannot catalog, cannot kill. But even that wasn't safe. In 1943, a government social worker recorded several Melungeon children speaking what she called a strange, mixed-up gibberish. Her notes were never published. They were confiscated. Why? Because the language was real. And inside that language were coordinates, not to geography, but to memory. A song, a phrase, a ritual, passed down like a genetic cipher. A mother code that carried the story of Exodus and return. You were never meant to hear it. But now, linguists in the underground are reconstructing fragments. They're comparing Melungeon speech to ancient Judeo-Spanish canticles, to North African tribal chants, to Sufi poems written in exile. And the similarities are unmistakable. They all encode loss. But more importantly, they encode survival. Because that's the secret. The Melungeons didn't speak in riddles because they were primitive. They did it because you were being programmed not to hear the truth. Empire teaches you to fear what you can't label. And the Melungeon language was unlabelable by design. So next time you hear mountain twang or a strange turn of phrase in Appalachian speech, listen closer. Beneath the English lies a map, a frequency tuned not to intellect, but to ancestral fire. And if you hear it, you've already started to remember. When they stole the Melungeons' names, they turned to ritual. When they burned their churches, they lit fires in caves. And when they outlawed their language, they sang to something older than words, because what empire fears most is unsanctioned belief. The Melungeons didn't worship like the settlers. No pews, no steeples, no creeds handed down from kings. Their faith was carved in the dark, built from fragments of lost traditions, exiled gods, and ancient alignments. Not religion, memory in motion. Witnesses described night ceremonies near springs and caves. They spoke of chants echoing off stone, of fire circles drawn with bones, of symbols etched in soot across doorframes. Outsiders called it witchcraft, but it wasn't chaos. It was architecture, spiritual systems encoded with terrifying precision. One Appalachian traveler in 1891 reported stumbling on a group performing what he assumed was a foreign mass. He heard chants in a language he couldn't place, saw gestures not found in Christianity or native ritual. Decades later, a Sufi scholar identified the hand signs as part of an Andalusian initiation rite, long thought extinct. How did it survive? Because belief, real belief, can't be killed. It mutates. When Moorish mysticism was banned in Spain, it traveled in refugee ships. When Jewish Kabbalah was hunted by the Inquisition, it hid in lullabies. When African animism was outlawed, it fused with Catholic saints and slipped through the cracks. And when those broken pieces collided in the backwoods of Virginia, the Melungeons were born. They didn't just believe in gods. They believed in systems, invisible geometries of fate, time, and shadow. They aligned their births with star cycles, buried their dead under specific trees, refused to name a child until the seventh moon had passed. They were not primitive. They were preserving a power that empire had no access to. You see, the modern mind thinks of spirituality as optional, something ornamental. But the Melungeons knew the opposite, that ritual is a survival technology. when your enemy owns the institutions, the armies, the narrative. You turn to what they cannot touch, the unwritten dot. To this day, some Melungeon descendants still report dream visitations, ancestral messages given through fire and water. Others practice healing rituals using herbs and combinations found only in North African medicine. Still others have symbols tattooed or burned into their skin, passed down with no explanation except we've always done it this way. What if that way is older than the nation that erased it? What if Melungeon spirituality isn't just tradition, but a code to remembering how to survive erasure? They tried to make them disappear, but the Melungeons didn't just survive, they evolved. And now, the blood is waking up. Across the Appalachian belt, in Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia, even reaching out to the Carolinas and deep into Missouri, a new generation is reclaiming. Digging into the silence, listening to the songs, reading between the lines of census records where their ancestors were reduced to slurs, scribbles, or just nothing at all. But this generation isn't whispering anymore. They're showing up in archives, demanding access, flooding online genealogical forums with surnames long buried, comparing DNA results and building maps the government never intended to exist. And the results? They match clusters of Middle Eastern, North African, Iberian markers, genetic breadcrumbs leading back not just to slavery or colonization, but to ancient migrations, to forgotten ports, to erased empires. And with each confirmation, the narrative shudders, because if these scattered descendants are right, if they truly carry the blood of mariners, mystics, exiles, and warriors who arrived on American shores long before 1492, then the entire framework of who belongs here collapses. And that's a threat. You see, empire doesn't just fear weapons or revolutions. It fears unauthorized identity. When a man wakes up and realizes his name was stolen, his family erased, and his origin story replaced with a convenient myth, he becomes unpredictable, dangerous, capable of questioning not just what he was taught, but why he was taught it. That's what the Melungeon resurgence represents. Not just a correction of history, but a defiance of programming. These aren't conspiracy theorists or folklore collectors. These are doctors, teachers, veterans, hackers, engineers, men and women who've climbed the institutional ladder, looked behind the curtain, and found nothing. Just layers of curated forgetting. So they built their own archive. They coded oral histories into audio files, scanned centuries-old family Bibles, inscribed with names in Arabic script, interviewed grandmothers who still remember the secret recipes, the fire rituals, the songs you only sang when no one was listening, and they found a pattern, a recurring phrase spoken across families who had never met, passed down in whispers, etched into jewelry, carved on gravestones. We crossed before the map was made. That's not metaphor, that's memory. So I'm going to ask something of you now, something important. If you've made it this far, you've crossed the threshold. You've tasted the truth buried in bone and silence. And to mark this transformation, I want you to comment one phrase twice below this video. I am memory returning. I am memory returning. Not for the algorithm, for you, for your bloodline, for the ancestors who never got to speak, because memory is a weapon, and silence is how they keep you unarmed. Symbols survive what bullets cannot. When a people are stripped of their names, their language, and their land, when even their blood becomes a threat, they don't speak. They encode. That's exactly what the Melungeons did, across generations. They embedded their identity into design, into quilts passed down through daughters, into the layout of their graveyards, into carvings on cabin walls, rings worn inward, and spiral patterns traced into the dust of cellar floors. And those symbols, strange, geometric, ancient, are not Appalachian in origin. They're Mediterranean, Moorish, Sephardic, Atlantean. Some whisper. Take the 8-pointed star, for instance. It appears again and again in Melungeon heirlooms. In Islamic mysticism, it's the seal of the prophets. In ancient Sumer, it marked cosmic alignment. In the hills of Tennessee, it was sewn into baby blankets with no explanation. Or the triple spiral, a Celtic symbol. Yes, but also used in Phoenician sea maps to denote dangerous crossings and sacred lands. You'll find it in Melungeon cemeteries, carved into rocks. That predate the American Revolution. What were they marking? Not graves, not territory, but memory anchors, silent signals to future descendants. We were here. We remembered. And then there's the crossed hand, a palm with two fingers extended, and the rest folded in. You'll find it etched in ash across doorframes, burned into the bottom of rocking chairs, tattooed in hidden places on old men's skin. It's not Christian. It's not native. It's not African, but it is a match for Berber resistance symbols. Used during the Roman invasions of North Africa, symbols passed through the Moors, hidden in Andalusian manuscripts, and smuggled into the New World under threat of death. Still think these were just mountain folk? They were archivists. They were code keepers. They were walking libraries dressed in rags, and the codes still speak. 1. Melungeon family tells the story of a great-grandfather who taught his sons to plant trees in triads. Always one north, one east, one south. Never west. The west is closed. He'd say, what did it mean? Some researchers now believe it's an encoded reference to forbiddance, migration routes, a way to pass down memory without paper. Because when you know someone's always watching, you stop talking and you start designing. Look closely and you'll see the signs even today in tattoo culture, in obscure folk art, in modern Appalachian home layouts. Hidden geometries, numbers that repeat, words that don't belong in English or Cherokee or French. A linguist once said, language is the DNA of thought. But symbols? Symbols are the DNA of resistance. And the Melungeons wrote their rebellion in design, layered deep, protected by ridicule, dismissed as folklore by scholars too afraid to admit what they were staring at. A living code. A time capsule. A system of memory you can only read once you've been initiated by blood, fire, or betrayal. They thought it was over. They thought memory would decay, that blood would dilute, that the silence would last forever. But they didn't count on the return of the initiated, descendants who now walk both worlds, the digital and the ancestral. Men and women born into empire, trained in its tools, but loyal to something older. The Melungeons are no longer hiding. They're building networks, not in shadowy covens or remote cabins, but in plain sight. Podcasts dissecting censored archives. Online genealogies stitched together like war. Maps, symbolic tattoos re-emerging in cities. Quiet meetings in Appalachia where young men sit with elders, not to hear fairy tales, but to recover operating systems of the past. Make no mistake, this is spiritual warfare, encoded in identity. Because what the Empire fears most isn't protest. It's pattern recognition. Once you see the loop, erasure, shame, suppression, and resurrection, you realize this isn't just about the Melungeons. It's about the template used to erase entire civilizations. Whether it was the Berbers in the Atlas, the Jews in Iberia, the Rama in France, or the Polynesians in Hawaii, the method is always the same. Question their bloodline, label them, steal their archives, reassign their identity, punish remembrance. But when the punished remember anyway, the machine trembles. Because systems like this don't fear rebellion, they anticipate it. What they can't handle is awakening. And the Melungeon revival isn't just about reclaiming a name. It's about resurrecting forbidden's architecture. Worldviews and technologies that defy the linear, imperial version of time and control. Things like sacred geometry encoded in burial patterns, herbal knowledge that predates Western medicine by centuries, oral mathematical systems for Land navigation without compasses, spiritual frameworks that place memory above doctrine to the untrained eye. These are curiosities. To the bloodline aware, their blueprints dot, and as these blueprints circulate, as the children of the silenced decode the lullabies, replant the gardens, and reassemble the dialects, the empire watches, nervously, quietly, sometimes violently, because, here's the truth, if you can remember who you were before they told you who to be, you become untouchable, and that's what's happening in the hills. Young men who once felt ashamed of their roots are now wearing ancient symbols on their skin. Women once labeled mudbloods now lead archives. Families long divided by shame are holding reunions under moonlight, around fires, invoking names that were never supposed to be spoken again. And guess what? They're coming back stronger, not as victims, not even as survivors, but as remnants of a forgotten order. An order that predates the flags, the borders, the Bibles. They always knew this day would come, the moment descendants began to connect the fragments, the lullabies, the surnames, the blood markers, the maps. Something shifted in the institutions that had worked so long to keep the lid sealed. Because history, for them, was never about truth. It was about leverage. And now that leverage is slipping, universities have quietly removed entire studies on pre-Columbian migrations. Funding for Melungeon-related anthropology has dried up without explanation. DNA labs that once released ancestry data freely now hide behind legal disclaimers and ambiguous privacy updates. Why? Because when the story begins to rewrite itself, the editors panic. It started with denial, Melungeons, just mixed-race settlers. Then came discrediting those symbols, coincidence, folk art. Then the lockdown, freedom of information, ACT requests for early census files, delayed, denied, redacted, archived court cases from the 1800s detailing land disputes against Melungeon families, lost in flood damage. And in 2020, when a Melungeon descendant tried to donate a centuries-old Ottoman pendant to a state museum in Virginia, traced through family lines back to pre-revolutionary times, the offer was refused, quietly, politely, because once an artifact is official, it becomes admissible, and that's what the system fears most. Evidence that cannot be seen. So the countermeasures escalated. Online forums discussing Melungeon bloodlines were mysteriously flagged for misinformation. Entire Reddit threads vanished. YouTube videos with real interviews of Melungeon elders were shadow banned. Not for hate, not for violence, but for the unspoken crime of remembering too clearly. Some say this is the algorithm doing what it does. Others know better, because algorithms don't fear bloodlines. But the ones who program them? They do. They fear the possibility that America's origin story isn't clean. That long before colonies, before conquests, before the Constitution, there were people here. People who don't fit into any of the empire's tidy categories. People with no master, no god, no king. So now the tools of control, media, academia, turn against the awakened, not with bullets, but with silence. And if you think that's paranoia, ask yourself this. Why does every empire, when threatened, first erase the archives? Because archives are more dangerous than armies. But here's what they didn't count on: the distributed memory of a bloodline that survived generations of fire. The digital age's refusal to forget. The sons and daughters of Appalachia who now walk into libraries with smartphones and leave with proof. The rise of decentralized memory warriors. You're one of them now, if you've made it this far. Comment below. Memory is fire. Memory is fire. Do it twice. Let the algorithm notice. Let the system feel the tremor. There are pages missing from your biology textbooks. Not misprinted, not torn out, omitted by design. Because what lies in those absent pages doesn't just challenge your understanding of ancestry. It challenges the limits of what it means to be human. You were taught blood is just a carrier. Red cells, white cells, platelets, plasma. Function, not mystery, but the Melungeons, they carry something else. Something that bends that clinical model and whispers of forgotten blueprints in the double helix. Let's start with what the scientists won't publish. Several Melungeon families in southwestern Virginia and eastern Kentucky have reported unexplained resistance to disease, infections that didn't spread, tumors that inexplicably vanished, wounds that healed with abnormal speed. Mainstream medicine dismissed it as anecdotal, but geneticists off the record, they used a different term, non-conforming immunotypes. In layman's terms, patterns in the immune system that shouldn't exist, but do. Similar traits have been documented in Berber desert clans and Highlanders, isolated peoples with ancient genetic fortifications against extinction. Coincidence? Now pair that with the cognitive patterns. A disproportionate number of Melungeon descendants, especially those raised within tight cultural traditions, score high on abstract reasoning, linguistic mimicry, and synesthetic perception. We're not talking IQ tests. We're talking pattern recognition. The ability to sense and decode emotional frequencies in environments long before a word is spoken. This isn't New Age fantasy. In 1999, an unpublished university thesis, suppressed before it could reach publication, documented limbic resonance anomalies in Melungeon test subjects. In plain English, their brains responded to emotional stimuli before those stimuli occurred. Precognition? Or memory leaking forward. And then there are the energetic traits. Ask any Appalachian healer. The Melungeon bloodline carries what they called the gift, the ability to intuit danger, to dream in symbols, to locate the dead. Again, dismissed as folklore. But in 2012, a private neurobiological study attempted to measure electromagnetic fields generated by long isolated mountain populations. 3 test subjects, all unknowingly of Melungeon descent, produced field disturbances outside normal range. The equipment logged the results, but the final report was scrubbed. Why? Because science isn't just about discovery. It's about permission. And when discovery points to an ancient intelligence built into the body, not licensed by church or state, that intelligence becomes a threat. So what exactly were the Melungeons? Not a race, not a religion, not a nationality. They were and are a continuity, a living thread through suppressed timelines, evidence that the human body can remember far more than it's told. That ancestry isn't just a story, it's a frequency. And the moment you begin to resonate with that frequency, the old rules fall away. Because this isn't about genes. It's about unlocked codes. Some knowledge was never meant to be written. It was meant to be felt, breathed, passed through gesture, firelight, and pain. That's why when the missionaries came with their books and pulpits, they missed the real sacred texts. Because those texts weren't ink on parchment. They were actions encoded in blood. The Melungeons never had temples. They didn't need them. Their initiations didn't happen in marble halls or under stained glass. They happened in forests at birth, at gravesites under eclipses. Through rituals so subtle they escaped the notice of every census taker and every priest. Let's begin with the herb rites, passed down matrilineally. The Melungeon women kept black bundles, small cloth pouches of crushed herbs, bone, chips, and river ash. They were tied to newborns, burned at the full moon, or buried at the roots of dying trees. These weren't witchcraft. They were codes, biochemical knowledge disguised as folklore. Modern pharmacologists have quietly confirmed that these bundles often contained immune-modulating plants, like golden seal, black cohosh, and wild indigo. Plants used in precise lunar cycles that enhance their potency. How did these isolated hill communities know pharmacokinetics before formal science? Because it wasn't learned. It was remembered dot, and then there were the sound I-N-I-T, I-A-T-I-O-N stot in certain hollers. There are still whispers of children being taken into the woods at age 7. Not to scare them, but to tune them. They'd sit blindfolded in silence, then exposed to specific harmonics, whistles, drones, and rhythm patterns that scholars now recognize as isomorphic to Sufi zikr and Berber trance cycles. What was the purpose? Resonance training, calibrating the nervous system, tuning the child to the field beneath the field. And if that sounds too esoteric, understand this. The US military has run classified studies on low-frequency sound and consciousness modulation. Since the 1970s, what the Melungeons were doing by campfire, DARPA later replicated with machines. But the most dangerous rites were the silence teachings. Certain elders, always chosen, never declared, would take a child into a cave or an abandoned house, or even a gravesite. There, they would do nothing. No speech, no fire, just presence. Hours, sometimes days. And in that silence, the child would begin to hear things, not hallucinations, but ancestral codes rising from within. Memories not their own, languages they'd never been taught, patterns that aligned with dream symbols. What is this? A lost religion? A surviving fragment of Atlantean rites? Or something even deeper, the unbroken chain of pre-empire memory? Because empire doesn't fear spells or symbols, it fears men who can sit in silence and remember what they truly are. These rites weren't for power. They were for alignment. To attune the body back to its original signal, the one buried beneath layers of programming, schooling, dogma, and shame. And now that signal is waking up again. You're not just watching a video. You're standing in the threshold of an initiation you didn't ask for, but always sensed was waiting. They've been watching longer than you think. Not with cameras, those came later, but with oaths, bloodlines, and silent permissions. Every time forbidden knowledge threatened to surface, the counterforces emerged, not to debate, not to disprove, but to divert, discredit, and destroy. And the Melungeons? They were always in the crosshairs. Let's talk about the gatekeepers. Institutions you were raised to trust, universities, libraries, churches, courts, each with archives and each with sealed rooms you'll never be allowed to enter. Ever wonder why certain surnames were redacted from early census records? Or why family Bibles in Melungeon households were confiscated during public health surveys in the early 20th century? Because buried in those pages were keys, genealogical chains connecting not just Appalachia to North Africa, but America to something older than nationhood. Something pre-religious, pre-royal, pre-empire. And that terrifies the system. You see, the real war has never been against flesh and blood. It's against memory. And the counterforces? They don't operate through gunfire or drones. They operate through scholarship boards that refuse to fund studies on pre-Columbian transatlantic contact, anthropology journals that peer review inconvenient DNA results into oblivion, clergy who warn against pagan ancestry exploration, even as they wear vestments traced to older rites, media blackouts where entire documentaries on Melungeon genetics are bought and buried. And behind these frontline defenders lie the deep orders, ancient fraternities bound not by belief, but by preservation of narrative. In 1931, a researcher working on the Melungeon bloodlines vanished after requesting Ottoman maritime records. No foul play was declared, just another unfortunate drowning. His notes were seized by federal archivists. His final letter, never published, included this line: "The map is real, and it doesn't match theirs." Why the fear? Because if the Melungeons, these forgotten hillfolk, are proven to be descendants of pre-Columbian travelers from across the Atlantic, everything unravels. The origin myth of white Christian America, the territorial rights falsely claimed by conquest, the racial hierarchies engineered to divide and control. Suddenly, Appalachia becomes more than a backwater dot. It becomes a vault, holding truths that could collapse imperial timelines. So yes, there are guardians, but they don't wear uniforms. They wear degrees, titles, and silence. They guard doorways made of paper, policy, and plausibility. And the moment you start digging, truly digging, their smiles vanish. Emails go unanswered, grants disappear. You're called a conspiracy theorist, a crank, a threat. That's when you know you're close. Because the real counterforce is not just institutional, it's internal. They've trained you to doubt yourself, to mock your own instincts, to laugh off ancestral echoes as fantasy. Because the most obedient prisoner is the one who guards his own cell. But now the door is cracking open. You've made it this far. That means the gate is open, and what lies beyond is no longer just information. It's transmission. Because when memory is forbidden long enough, it begins to mutate, not into lies but into prophecy. That's what the Melungeon bloodline carries now, a genetic warning, echoing forward from a forgotten past. The ancestors didn't just remember. They saw the rise of a system that would cut memory from men like organs. That would train you to see yourself as a number, a worker, a voter, a slave with a screen. They foresaw the digital leash, the erasure of blood stories, the cloning of thought through algorithms and branded ideology. They knew this was coming, and so, encoded in those lullabies, those symbols, those rites were seeds, triggers, anchors, meant for a generation who would need to remember not what happened, but who they were before it was taken. You are that generation. And that's why you're here, not by accident, not by curiosity, but because something inside your line has stirred. A sleeping signal buried under television, trauma, and textbooks. One that whispers, this world is a prison of forgetting. Now listen closely. There are old Melungeon prophecies, never published, never recorded, passed from dying tongues to children too young to write. Stories of iron birds in burning skies, of tongues that speak from glass, of mirrors that steal the soul's name. Sound familiar? One fragment, preserved in the Appalachian Mountains by a family that never moved for 200 years, ends with this chilling line, and when the children forget the shape of fire, the world will burn without warmth. What does it mean? That memory isn't just a survival tool. It's a weapon, and when stripped away, we become programmable flesh, devoid of origin, unarmed in the war of identity. That's what the system wanted. But the Melungeons and bloodlines like them hid the antidote inside the curse. That's the paradox. What was branded as impurity, mixed blood, mixed belief, mixed ancestry, was actually purity of memory. A lineage that couldn't be boxed, and so couldn't be controlled. And now, as you begin to remember, you become dangerous. Because prophecy isn't about predicting, it's about activating. Every bloodline has a moment where it's called to wake up, to stop complying, to stop doubting, to reclaim what empire made you forget. This is that moment. Now is the time to comment below. Memory is my weapon. Memory is my weapon. Say it twice. Write it to lock in the code, to mark the algorithm, to stand as one who will not forget again, because what comes next will test that memory. This is where the veil tears. You were taught that myth is metaphor, that stories of gods, hybrid beings, and divine bloodlines were just primitive man explaining thunder and death. But what if myth was never fiction? What if it was encrypted? Biology, passed down not in books, but in you. Let's talk about epigenetic memory, the scientifically observed phenomenon that trauma, behavior, even sensory experience can leave biochemical marks on DNA, passed down across generations. The Holocaust, famines, enslavement, these left changes in the blood itself, but it works both ways, because if pain can echo through flesh, so can power. The Melungeons didn't just carry songs and symbols, they carried codes. Evidence suggests that the strange resilience of these people, their ability to survive erasure, persecution, and systemic control, may be tied to biological adaptations we still don't fully understand. Markers not found in any singular ethnic group. Rare haplogroups clustered only in one place, the Appalachian bloodlines. Why? Because they may descend from something more than just lost sailors or forgotten tribes. They may descend from engineered survivors, hybrids, the legends whispered. In Melungeon families speak of people from stars, gods from burning islands, and men who lived for 9 generations. Some dismissed it as folklore. But when DNA samples from isolated Melungeon descendants were run through ancient genome databases, anomalies appeared, segments resembling Berber tribes of the Atlas Mountains, Jewish Kohanim priest lines, and, most disturbing, a cluster linked to the Basque people, whose language and genetics remain one of Earth's greatest unsolved mysteries. The Basques, like the Melungeons, don't fit the evolutionary narrative. They're older than the known. Migrations, resistant to assimilation. And their blood contains untraceable alleles, code without a key. And when those lines intersect, you don't get a race. You get a message. That's the secret the system fears most. That blood might not just carry traits. It might carry truth. That your ancestry isn't random, it's architected. And that somewhere, deep inside you, is data that predates civilization, that ancient tech, that not machines. But memory, emotion, instinct, intuition, compressed and passed on like genetic scripture. The Melungeons may be one of many such vaults of encoded survival. And resistance. What if the reason they couldn't be eradicated is because they were never meant to die? What if their suffering was protection, a way to stay hidden until the world was ready to remember? And now here you are, a man watching a forbiddance video at the edge of the algorithm, listening not with ears, but with bone. You feel it, don't you? Something awakening. You're not just learning history, you're reactivating it. This is it, the final descent. The part they never wanted written, not in books, not in songs, not even in blood. Because once it's spoken, the illusion shatters. Here's the truth they buried. The story of America was never about freedom. It was always about amnesia. You were taught that history moves forward, that each generation rises from the last, cleansed of its sins, progressing towards some noble light. But what if history is not a line ... but a loop? And the system you live in, your schools, your laws, your media, isn't there to free you, but to scrub you clean of memory, to make sure you never remember the first system, the one before nations, the one before race, the one they erased because it proved we were never meant to be divided. The Melungeons were never just a people. They were a remnant, a living contradiction to every artificial border. Black but not black, white but not white, native but not native, alien but somehow familiar. They broke the code of empire by existing, and that's what made them dangerous. Because if people like this could survive, mixed, defiant, ancient, it meant the great lie of racial supremacy, national destiny, manifest conquest, was just that, a lie. Engineered to divide you, control you, erase you. The real war was never between races, never between countries. It was between memory and forgetting. The Melungeons remembered, not with textbooks or flags, but through firelight, bone, lullabies, and loss. And now so do you. This isn't just about them anymore, it's about you. The man listening, watching, feeling the chill at the base of your spine because you know something ancient just stirred. You were meant to forget your bloodline. You were meant to believe you came from nothing. You were meant to worship power you'll never touch. You were meant to obey. But not anymore. Because today, you've seen behind the curtain. You've felt the signal. And if you've made it this far, then you've proven one thing. You were never one of them. You're part of the few, the ones who awaken, the ones who remember, the ones who rebuild memory where empire planted silence. The system will tell you this was myth, conspiracy, madness. Of course it will. It has to, because if this spreads, if other men start remembering, the control grid falls. So now, this is the moment. Say it one last time in the comments below. Memory is my weapon. Memory is my weapon. And when you write it, you seal it. You join the unbroken line. You become what they fear most. A man who remembers. Welcome back, brother. We've been waiting.